In the spring of 1854, a young English baronet-in-waiting stepped aboard a ship in Rio de Janeiro and was never seen again. 12 years later, a heavy-set butcher from a dusty Australian town walked into a Sydney lawyer's office and said the drowned heir was sitting before him. He could not speak the dead man's native French. He did not recognize the dead man's school. He weighed almost twice what the slender aristocrat had weighed. And yet, for the better part of a decade, this man came astonishingly close to walking away with one of the great fortunes of Victorian England. Roger Charles Doty Tichborne was born in 1829, heir to a Hampshire baronetcy and a Catholic family of old money. Raised partly in Paris, he spoke French as a first language and was educated at Stonyhurst College in Lancashire. Friends described him as slim, reserved, and unmistakably a gentleman of his class. In March of 1853, he left England for a long private tour of South America, traveling through Chile, Peru, and Argentina. He was the kind of young man whose every habit, accent, and signature was known to dozens of people. That detail would matter enormously later. On the 20th of April, 1854, Roger boarded the Bella at Rio de Janeiro, bound for Jamaica. 4 days later, a capsized boat carrying the ship's name was found drifting off the coast of Brazil. There were no survivors. The Bella had gone down with everyone aboard, and Roger Tichborne, 25 years old, was presumed dead at sea. To the family lawyers, to the courts, and to most of the world, the matter was closed. The slim young heir had been swallowed by the Atlantic, and the title would pass quietly to the next in line. One person refused to believe a word of it. Roger's mother, Henriette, Lady Tichborne, would not accept her son's death. Estranged from much of the family and increasingly isolated, she clung to the hope that he had somehow survived. Encouraged, it was said, by a clairvoyant, she began placing advertisements in the Times in 1863, begging for any news of a shipwreck survivor. In 1865, she extended the search to the far side of the world, hiring a missing persons agency in Sydney to run notices in the Australian newspapers. She offered a reward. Somewhere in colonial New South Wales, a struggling butcher read those words and saw a way out. In the small town of Wagga Wagga, a bankrupt butcher known locally as Thomas Castro came forward. He told a remarkable story. He had survived the wreck of the Bella, he said, plucked from the sea by a passing ship called the Osprey, carried to Australia, and living there ever since under a false name to escape his family's expectations. He claimed to be Roger Tichborne. He could produce a pipe marked with the initials RCT, and he sprinkled his account with names and details that sounded, to hopeful ears, like genuine memory. It was enough to set the machinery in motion. In January of 1867, Lady Tichborne met the claimant in Paris. By most accounts, the meeting was brief, the room dim, and the man unwell in bed. Yet she embraced him at once as her lost Roger and never wavered again. She settled an income of £1,000 a year upon him and declared to anyone who would listen that her son had come home. Her certainty gave the claimant something money could not buy: legitimacy. If the dead man's own mother knew him, who were strangers to argue? But the wider family was not convinced, and they began to look very closely indeed. As investigators dug, a different man emerged from the shadows. The claimant, they came to believe, was not Roger Tichborne at all, but Arthur Orton, a butcher's son from Wapping in the East End of London who had gone to sea as a boy and drifted into the Australian outback. Station records named an Arthur Orton where no Thomas Castro appeared. The claimant had been seen in Wapping, quietly asking after the Orton family. The contrast was stark. Roger had been a slender, French-speaking Catholic gentleman. This man was vast, barely literate, and could not name the simplest facts of Roger's schooling. In May of 1871, the claimant took his case to court, suing to be recognized as the rightful baronet. The civil trial ran for nearly a year and gripped the nation. Day after day, the evidence mounted against him. A nobleman testified that the real Roger bore distinctive tattoos the claimant simply did not have. The claimant showed a startling ignorance of Latin, of geography, of Stonyhurst itself. Handwriting experts found his script resembled Orton's, not Tichborne's. And the heroic Osprey rescue, the heart of his whole story, dissolved under scrutiny. No such rescue had ever taken place. In March of 1872, the jury had heard enough. They rejected the claimant's suit, and the judge ordered him arrested for perjury on the spot. What followed was one of the longest criminal trials in English legal history, stretching across some 180 days. The prosecution summoned more than 200 witnesses, gathered from France, from Australia, from the streets of Wapping. One man who swore he had served aboard the rescuing Osprey was himself unmasked as a liar and convicted alongside the case. Brick by brick, the Crown dismantled the story the claimant had spent years building. The claimant's defense fell to Edward Keneally, a brilliant but combustible barrister whose conduct grew wilder as the case turned against him. He thundered about conspiracies, accusing the Catholic Church, the government, and the legal establishment of plotting to crush an honest man. The strategy enraged the bench and helped seal his client's fate. When it was over, the presiding judge delivered a withering rebuke, and Keneally was later stripped of his rank and effectively driven from the bar. Yet his theatrics had an unexpected effect. They turned a convicted impostor, in the eyes of many ordinary Britons, into a folk hero. On the 28th of February, 1874, the jury returned in barely half an hour. The claimant was not Roger Tichborne, they found. He had not been wronged. He was Arthur Orton, and he was guilty of perjury. The sentence was severe: 2 consecutive terms of 7 years each, 14 years of hard labor. To the courts, justice had been done and a brazen fraud finally crushed. But out in the streets, the verdict landed differently. To working people who had followed every twist in the papers, the giant butcher looked less like a swindler and more like a common man broken by the powerful. Astonishingly, the conviction made the claimant more popular, not less. Mass meetings filled Hyde Park demanding his release. A political movement sprang up around his cause, and Keneally himself was swept into Parliament as the people's champion. Souvenirs, figurines, and ballads spread his image across the country. For a man the law had branded a fraud, Arthur Orton had become one of the most famous figures in the empire, the center of a genuine popular crusade that fused outrage at injustice with deep distrust of the establishment that had condemned him. He served 10 years and was released on license in 1884, but the fame curdled into poverty. He drifted through music halls and circuses, traded on his notoriety, and slowly faded. In 1895, broke and desperate, he sold a written confession to a newspaper admitting he was Arthur Orton, then almost at once took it back. He died destitute in 1898. Thousands lined the route of his funeral. In a final strange gesture of mercy, the Tichborne family allowed a card bearing the name Sir Roger Charles Doughty Tichborne to rest on the coffin of the man who had spent his life insisting he was exactly that.